Gun violence in New York these days is relatively mild in comparison to the record-breaking bloodshed of the early 1990s. That was a rough era in which the city's annual homicide rate exceeded 5,000, thanks in large part to a multiplying of violent gangs battling for turf in which to sell narcotics. Among them were some of the most dangerous gangs in America at the time, and behind these gangs were some of the most ruthless gang leaders to ever walk the planet. Today we will continue our series and go in depth in some of the stories of the most ruthless gang leaders in New York's history. Number 7. Howard Mason of the Bebos Gang and is an American narcotics trafficker and organized crime figure. Mason ran a smuggling gang called the Bebos in the Jamaica, Queens neighborhood of New York City, with his partner Lorenzo "Fat Cat" Nichols. The gang sold narcotics and netted as much as $200,000 per week in profits. But it was not until Mason ordered the hit on a police officer named Eddie Byrne, which led to increased law enforcement attention. On December 11, 1989, Mason was convicted on federal charges, including the assassination of Officer Byrne. After 4 years of legal wrangling, including questions of Mason's mental competency, he was given a life sentence in 1994. With his absence, the narcotics crew was taken over by Eric "Bebo" Lucas, who was a violent kid from the Brooklyn streets where Mason grew up. Yet Lucas was years younger than Mason. Mason is serving his life sentence at ADX Florence Supermax facility in Florence, Colorado. Number 6. Damien "World" Hardy from the Cash Money Brothers. Damien Hardy was born on November 3, 1974, in Brooklyn, New York. In 1991, Damien and Myron formed the Cash Money Brothers narcotics trafficking organization, the Cash Money Brothers. The group proceeded to wrestle control of crack coke sales in the Bedford-Stuyvesant's Lafayette Gardens housing project, away from more established narcotic traffickers. After seizing control, the Hardys used the housing project, comprised of approximately 2,680 residents and 7 buildings, each at least 13 stories tall, as a base of operations. In 1993, Damien was convicted on weapons charges and witness tampering and given a sentence of 2 to 4 years in state prison. He was accused of both shooting at narcotics officers and ordering the shooting of a state witness against another CMB member. He was released from prison in April of 1996. In 1998, Damien was ejected from a Brooklyn roller skating ring by a bouncer. In retaliation for the perceived slight, he had the guy assassinated by another CMB member. On June 12, 1999, Myron was shot to death in Lafayette Gardens over narcotics territory by Rumel Nino Davis, the nephew of Ivory Peanut Davis, who led the rival Davis narcotics trafficking organization. The shooting prompted Damien, who was in prison at the time of Myron's homicide, to initiate a massacre spree in retaliation for his brother's death. Things got crazy at time, and more than 50 people were assassinated in retaliation. On July 12, 2002, Hardy and CMB members were charged with the attempted robbery and kidnapping of Ashabuddin Shakur. Police found Shakur blindfolded and bound in a Brooklyn apartment controlled by CMB and seized a loaded AK-47 assault rifle. Down the line, Hardy began dating rapper Kimberly Lil Kim Jones in 2002. The two had known each other since the first grade, and Jones had previously dated Damien's brother, Myron. During the relationship, the younger Hardy allegedly physically abused Lil Kim to the point she had to get cosmetic surgery. Lil Kim shared a New Jersey mansion with Hardy and gifted him a Range Rover while the two were together. In September of 2003, Hardy was involved in a shootout with members of rapper Curtis 50 Cent Jackson's security team outside of a New Jersey DoubleTree hotel. The hostilities reportedly stemmed from an incident earlier in the year whereby Hardy confronted Jackson regarding an on-air insult directed at Jones during an interview at New York's Hot 97 radio station. The confrontation took place outside of the station immediately following the interview. An 18-month joint investigation by the NYPD, FBI, ICE, and the U.S. Attorney's Office culminated in Hardy's arrest upon his arrival at New York's John F. Kennedy International Airport on August 15, 2004. Initially, an indictment charging Hardy and 12 other CMB members with federal racketeering and narcotics trafficking was filed on July 19, 2005. Hardy was indicted on one count of conspiring to traffic narcotics, but a superseding indictment, filed in 2008, charged him with 26 counts, including narcotics trafficking conspiracy, racketeering conspiracy, 6 assassinations in aid of racketeering, and illegal use of firearms. Hardy's federal drug trafficking trial began on April 1, 2015, nearly 10 years after his indictment. On April 29, 2015, both Hardy was found guilty on all charges, which included convicted of racketeering, kidnapping, narcotics trafficking, and all 6 counts of homicide. Number 5. Omar Porte of the United Blood Nation. Omar Porte, also known as OG Mac, is an American gang leader, known for being the founder of the United Blood Nation gang while serving a prison sentence at Rikers Island. Porte began his criminal career as a robber at the age of 17. In the early hours of August 16, 1987, he claimed to have witnessed homicide. At the time of his original testimony, Porte was facing multiple charges in New York, stemming from his arrest on August 31, 1987. He faced substantial prison time, if convicted. Instead, as part of a cooperation agreement, Porte was allowed to plead to 2 to 6 years. For all charged crimes, received credit for 21 months' time served and was promised a favorable letter to the parole board. He started serving his sentence on June 9, 1989. He was released on June 20, 1990. In August 1992, Porte was sentenced to 5 years in prison for criminal possession of weapon in the 3rd degree. He and a fellow inmate, Leonard, established the United Blood Nation, initially as a prison gang, while incarcerated at Rikers Island in 1993. The United Blood Nation would become responsible for spreading gang violence from Los Angeles to New York City. On March 12, 1996, Porte led an attack, armed with a shiv fashioned from a Scrabble game piece, on members of the rival Latin Kings gang. 3 inmates were slashed in the incident. Porte was released from prison on June 22, 1999, and returned to the streets to build the Bloods into a powerful street gang. He divided the gang into numerous subgroups, or sets. Porte led the 1-8 Trey faction and ruled over a narcotics, prostitution, and theft empire by recruiting gang members as young as 16 years of age and ordering numerous acts of violence against rival drug dealers. On August 27, 2002, Porte was convicted of 10 counts of criminal activity. Porte is currently incarcerated in ADX Florence in Colorado. Number 4. Luis Filipe. Luis Filipe, also known as King Blood, is a Cuban-American former gang leader and is the founder of the New York chapter of the Latin Kings street gang. Born in Havana, Cuba, Filipe emigrated to the United States in the Mariel boat lift in 1980. 6 years later, in 1986, after fleeing Chicago, he founded the New York chapter of the Latin Kings. In 1995, he was convicted of ordering multiple assassinations from prison by writing to members of the Latin Kings on the outside. He was sentenced to life imprisonment plus 45 years. Furthermore, the judge added extraordinary conditions, surprising even prosecutors. The judge said Filipe must serve the sentence in solitary confinement. Filipe is currently incarcerated at ADX Florence. Number 3. Alex Rudaj. Alex Rudaj started out as an associate of the Gambino crime family. He is not the only Albanian to do so. The mob mainly uses the Albanians as enforcers and hit men. While the Albanians were getting their hands dirty, the Italian mobsters were far away from any incriminating bloodshed, no doubt counting the money they made by assassinating a rival. By the early 1990s, Rudaj realized that he could use Albanian muscle to form his own crew. Slowly but surely, he and a group of other Albanian and Italian gangsters, several of them former associates of La Cosa Nostra, started taking over illegal gambling in the Morris Park and Arthur Avenue areas of the Bronx and in Westchester County. After succeeding in getting their foot in the door, they decided to go for the big prize, territory that was claimed by the Italian mafia. In the summer of 2001, they decided to take on the mob. In June, Rudaj and over a dozen of his men entered a gambling parlor run by members of the Lucchese crime family in Astoria, Queens. The heavily armed group of thugs made it clear that they were now in charge of illegal gambling in Astoria. Even though they were taking over mob territory, the Rudaj crew still had enormous respect for the ultimate role models of organized crime. But you can only push so far. Gambino leader Arnold Squitieri had enough and wanted to talk with these rogue mobsters. The sit-down took place at a gas station. Squitieri did not come alone. 20 armed Gambino mobsters accompanied their boss. Alex Rudaj, on the other hand, had only managed to bring 6 members of his crew. According to undercover FBI agent Joaquin Garcia, who infiltrated the Gambino crime family during this period, Squitieri told Rudaj that the fun was over and that they should stop expanding their operations. The Albanians and Gambinos then pulled out their weapons. Knowing they were outnumbered, the Albanians threatened to blow up the gas station with all of them in it. This ended the discussion, and both groups pulled back. By 2006, all of the main players involved in this sit-down were in prison. Rudaj and his 6th family had been picked off the street in October of 2004 and charged with a variety of racketeering and gambling charges. After a trial, Rudaj and his main lieutenants were all found guilty. In 2006, Rudaj, at that time 38 years old, was sentenced to 27 years in prison. Number 2. Pistol Pete Rolack of the Sex Money Murder Gang. Pistol Pete Rolack was born in New York. As boy growing up, he was tied to Mr. Untouchable, heroin kingpin Nicky Barnes. Peter Rolack came up in the game, growing up in the Soundview projects of the Bronx. During the 1980s crack epidemic, Rolack earned his nickname Pistol Pete after starting his own gang. Sex, money, murder. He and his underlings incorporated the organization to launder the narcotics money and expanded its operations outside New York. Pete and his gang set a new benchmark for violence. The violence around New York's late 1980s crack epidemic gave birth to a homicide epidemic in the city. Out of that grew some violent crews who had been born and raised in these extremely dangerous, poverty-stricken neighborhoods. Soundview in the Bronx was one of the most notorious, alongside places like Brownsville and Brooklyn. So, the SMM guys grew up used to gunfire and murder from a very early age. Usually the violence gets delegated, but Pete really didn't mind carrying it out himself. So his reputation spread in the clubs and through the music. People saw him as this dashing guy at the head of this very violent clique. When the United Blood Nation on the East Coast was formed in the mid-1990s, SMM were considered so formidable and notorious that these founders of the Bloods wanted them involved because it gave this new organization a whole violent edge. SMM modeled themselves on the Italian mafia, although you can't compare their power. Street crews and their petty beefs are very different from major organized crime, and the Bloods are nowhere near as powerful as the mafia, although they are more prevalent. But Pistol Pete and the others had a fascination for Italian organized crime. They saw it as being very glamorous, but also a poke in the eye of authority. Yet street crews like SMM were more dangerous than the mafia in a way because they were so much quicker to shoot. Personal slights would escalate into a homicide. If the mafia rubs anyone out, it's generally about money or business. With SMM, it would take nothing. They were one of only crews in the Bronx at that time who were going out of town, as they called it back then, to sell narcotics. Other crews stayed in their neighborhoods. Pistol Pete were going up to places such as Kingston, New York, setting everything up there. When they got arrested, They fell back to the Bronx and started sending out the youngsters. They stayed off the radar to look for other places to open other franchises. The big turning point was the homicides of two fellow SMM members at an annual Thanksgiving football game in the Bronx in 1997 on Pistol Pete's orders. Everyone was there watching this game with their kids, and the bullets started to fly. Enough was enough. People felt SMM had turned on their own neighborhood. So these long-held conspiracies of silence about not saying anything to the police really broke down. Rolack would ultimately confess to pulling the trigger on many of his rivals, but justice wouldn't stop his killer reputation. Once behind bars, he continued to orchestrate assassinations. At the age of 25, in order to avoid the death penalty, Pistol Pete Rolack accepted a plea bargain of life behind bars in solitary confinement. Number 1. Clarence "Preacher" Heatley of the Preacher Crew. Clarence Heatley was born in New York City and grew up in Harlem. Heatley, who dropped out of school in the 4th grade, was sent to juvenile detention by the time he was 9 years old. Eventually, Heatley grew to 6 feet 7 inches. At some point, Heatley acquired the nickname Preacher. His violent reputation also earned him the nickname the Black Hand of Death. In 1983, Heatley established his criminal organization, which would come to be known as the Preacher Crew. Sometime in 1986, Heatley, aware that he was the subject of investigation by law enforcement, voluntarily went to Harlem's 32nd Police Precinct to address his concerns regarding police inquiries with the chief detective. Much of Heatley's income was derived by extorting local narcotic dealers. In many cases, the payment was made with the understanding that the Preacher Crew would assassinate the dealer's rival. The organization's enforcers were known as janitors, and some of them were given tattoos depicting a bucket and a mop dripping with blood. Allegedly, Heatley was the architect of the 1989 kidnapping of Donald Porter, 12-year-old nephew of Preacher Crew member Johnny Apple Porter. A $500,000 ransom demand was delivered to Donald's older brother, Harlem drug kingpin Rich Porter. But his biggest source of revenue came from trafficking crack and coke. Heatley's organization, sometimes known as the Family, truly was a family affair that included his son, daughter, and girlfriend. According to former Preacher Crew member Heatley and his associates abducted R&B superstar Bobby Brown at gunpoint in April of 1993. Associates of Heatley introduced themselves, at his behest, to the recording star at a Manhattan nightclub before convincing him to follow them to an apartment in the Bronx. After being beaten, Brown was taken to another apartment and held captive, naked, gagged, and hogtied, except for when he was permitted to place a call to then-wife Whitney Houston to relay the kidnapper's demand of $400,000 in cash in exchange for the singer's release. Brown supposedly had an outstanding debt of $25,000 with a New Jersey-based dealer who'd supplied him with coke. The day after Brown's phone call, Whitney Houston complied with the kidnapper's order to show up alone with the money at an abandoned building. She wore a wig and dark glasses, so as not to be recognized by the public, and turned the cash over to Heatley himself. Heatley kept half and the rest was divided amongst his associates. The Preacher Crew was eventually targeted by the FBI's C-11 squad, a task force specifically formed to investigate H and coke trafficking organizations operating in New York City. The squad was comprised of 12 FBI agents, 3 DEA agents, 12 NYPD officers, and 3 IRS agents. After one of the organization's members was arrested by C-11 squad members and agreed to cooperate with investigators, Heatley and 3 associates attempted to abduct the informant as he left a New York City courthouse. Following a brief chase, the van in which Heatley and the others rode was stopped by police, who seized 3 lead pipes, 4 gorilla masks, duct tape, and rope from the occupants. On July 15, 1996, Heatley was indicted on 3 counts of homicide and conspiracy to slaughter in the aid of racketeering. On February 5, 1999, Heatley pleaded guilty to federal racketeering, participation in 13 homicides in aid of racketeering, 1 attempted slaughter, participation in a continuing criminal enterprise involving narcotics, robbery, and extortion. Heatley was handed a 225-year sentence by the judge in charge of the case.